All right. Well, good evening. My name is Rachel Ringenberg Miller, and I serve as the Denominational Minister of Ministerial Leadership for Mennonite Church USA. And this is a role I've been in for almost 4 years. Previous to that, I was a congregational pastor for 15 years. So definitely been on the side of transition from the pastoral end. Right now, my family and I call Goshen, Indiana home, and we attend 8th Street Mennonite Church. God, we thank you for this opportunity to gather together, to discern, to dream, to imagine a new stage of our congregation as congregations prepare to say goodbye to one pastor and welcome another. We know that you are in our midst, there to support us, to guide us in this journey. Amen. So once again, it is good to see you all. Thanks for joining the Zoom this evening. Our focus today is on the process of transitions, and the key audience for this webinar are search committees, congregational members, congregational leaders. But if you don't fit in any of those categories, you are still welcome to this webinar. During our time together, this is kind of the flow of our conversation. So we're going to begin with real talk about pastoral transitions. Then we'll move into discerning and dreaming. Like, so what do we do next? Our pastor is leading. What's the next thing? Then practical steps, and then Q&A. And then beyond this conversation, there'll be opportunities for you guys to engage in conversation with one another. As I was saying, pastoral transitions are a natural part of life. Your pastor will at some point leave your congregation, and they will leave for all sorts of reasons. The majority that have nothing to do with you or the congregation. So in the case of myself, I still care deeply for the congregations I served, but I left these churches because I felt like God was calling me elsewhere and I needed to follow. And the same is likely for your pastor. God is calling them somewhere and they have to follow. In a pastoral transition, there are a lot of emotions, and it's really important that as a congregation that you acknowledge all the emotions. So when your pastor decides that it's time to leave, to transition, it's normal to feel sad, to maybe feel a little angry, like why are they leaving? Maybe denial, surprise. Maybe you feel excitement. I mean, who knows? You'll have lots of emotions, and all of them are normal. And it's important for you and the congregation to express these emotions in healthy ways. Change is hard, and these emotions can come to the surface because you care about your congregation, you care about your pastor. And so whatever emotions you are feeling, it's because your congregation matters. And that's really important to keep in mind. This is a good thing. So because there are emotions when the relationship change, you need to take time to sit with those. And you also need to take time to say goodbye to your pastor and to celebrate the time spent following Jesus together. So generally, what a goodbye looks for your pastor is a final worship service, which includes a time for the pastor and the congregation to offer blessings to one another. Generally, the conference minister is there to help with this transition and to offer an official release of congregational responsibility. And of course, usually somewhere in there is some food. Oh, thanks, Cami. Um, there is some sort of potluck. In my case, I think we had a potluck and we had some cake to celebrate one another. Now, one thing I strongly encourage is that you take time to say goodbye to your pastor before you move on to the next steps. And that's because there are a lot of things to consider. And when you jump from one spot to another, you can sometimes muddy the water. And so you need to take time to work through each step separately. So I encourage you to first celebrate your pastor, say goodbye to your pastor, and then move on to the next steps. So I'm curious, you guys are on this Zoom call for a reason. And so I would like to just take a moment now to get a sense of where your congregation is in terms of the emotions you are feeling as a congregation. And so this is not an exhaustive list, but I'm going to ask you to consider right now, is the primary emotion in your congregation sadness? Is the primary emotion hope? Is the primary emotion anxiety? Is the primary emotion excitement? And I'm actually not able to write these words in the chat either. So we'll do it this way. If your congregation's primary emotion is sadness, then I would like you to go to your react button on your the bottom of your screen. And I would like you to, if you're feeling sad, I would like you to use the rocket emoji. So if sad describes you, go ahead and shoot up your rocket emoji so we get a sense of where people are. And if you feel more comfortable writing it in the chat, you can do that as well. So if you're feeling sad, give that a thumb. You can say sad in the chat or use the rocket emoji. If you are feeling anxiety, or sorry, if you're feeling hope, you can write that in the chat. You can write the word hope, or you can use the heart emoji. All right, there's some hearts, there's some hope there. If you're feeling anxiety, you can write anxiety in the chat. Or you can use the balloon emoji in your reaction. So balloon emoji, or you can write anxiety. And then lastly, the last emotion, excitement. You're feeling excitement, feel free to write excitement in the chat or use the celebration emoji. So I have us kind of work through those emotions because it's important for us to consider all the things that we might be feeling and that the congregation is feeling. And as I said, none of these are better than the other. It's just important to acknowledge all the feelings that we're having. So once you have moved through saying goodbye to your pastor, you move into what I call the discernment stage. It's discernment followed by dreaming. The discernment stage in the pastoral transition is a process, um, is a opportunity to creatively explore how God is calling your congregation at this particular time and place. And so I encourage you to take time to consider, what does your congregation need? What does it look like now? Start asking what if questions. What if we did this instead of that? What if we moved this element of the service, for example? What if we turned our focus to you fill in the blank? So the discernment process is starting to ask, okay, well, who are we? Who are we called to be? What is God asking us right now? And so these what if questions will help you discover what kind of gifts and skills to look for in your next pastor. So the discernment stage is conversation, it's considering where you've been and looking forward to where you are headed. The pastor that you had now, or the pastor you had a couple years from now, isn't necessarily the pastor you're going to need at this next stage. So it's really important to consider who your congregation is now. Because the match between the congregation and the pastor is everything. You are going to need a congregation who can support you in becoming who God is calling you at this particular moment in time. Pastors are not cookie cutter images of one another. Each one is gifted and skilled in their own way. And so, focusing on what kind of pastoral gifts and skills best fit with who God is calling you today, focus on that rather than where the pastor you've had before, who is helping you in that particular stage. So, practically speaking, I suggest that after you do some discerning and dreaming conversations, and yes, you'll probably have more than one conversation, that the leadership group um, put together a summary of discussions of what has happened thus far. So you can kind of go back to that. And so here are some questions to ask one another. And you'll see this on the slide now. These can be guiding discussions for your congregation. What are your congregation's strengths? What are your congregation's growing edges? What are your hopes and dreams for the congregation? These are discernment questions that you can begin with and then move from there. And I'd like us to take a minute to reflect on these questions. If you have a little piece of paper next to you or your phone or whatever, I invite you just to take a minute to reflect on this first question. What are your congregation's strengths? And then what I'm going to have us do is do a waterfall response, which means you'll take some time to reflect on this question. And then after that, you'll type it in the chat. And then when I say go, everyone will hit return at the same time. And we'll see every congregation's strengths as they understand it. Does that make sense? And Cami, there's a slide with instructions. So the first question is, what are your congregation's strengths? And now I invite you to write that strength in the chat. I'll give you a minute to write. All right, everyone, hit your return button and let's see. Got long history, eager to learn, community, care, service, music, volunteers. That's something to be grateful for sure. Nice. So it's important to kind of start there. All right, what do we have going on in our congregation? Now, I'd like us to do this with the next question of what is a growing edge for your congregation? And this isn't an inherently negative question. This is just like realistically, what is a growing edge for your congregation? So take a minute to think about that. Growing edge. All right, go ahead and type that in. And when you're ready, okay, 1, 2, 3, hit return. What are some growing edges? Communication, young families, peace and justice, making decisions fast. I think that's all of us. Yeah, fantastic. All right, last question. What are your hopes and dreams for the congregation? Think about who your congregation, where it's been, where you feel like it's headed, and what's one hope you have for your congregation. All right, think about that for a minute. All right, go ahead and put that in the chat and hit return. So new team, attract young families, thinking about peacemaking in new ways, involvement of children. Yes. Embrace of new pastoral leader. Offer adequate spiritual development for children. Yeah. Yeah. Those are great. And if any of the things that you saw resonates with you, I invite you to write some of these things down that you saw in the chat to kind of spur on your conversation because discernment does take intentionality. It takes prayer. It takes trust in God and one another. And I find that in this discernment stage, it usually begins with a little bit of discomfort, like, oh my gosh, where are we headed? What are we going to do now? I remember a congregational member telling me once that when their pastor left, they felt unanchored. You know, they just felt unsure about what was next for them. So there's that discomfort there. Is completely normal. But what I find is that through this discernment process, it usually then ends with hope that God is with us, that something new is springing forth. And so while it's quite tempting to go full steam ahead on your pastoral search, I really encourage you to begin with discernment work. You can start to form the search committee, but the work of the search committee is better informed if the congregation has a chance to talk and discern together. And that's why these questions that we just went through can be helpful. They're helpful not only to you as a congregation, but they're also helpful to the search committee. So as I said, then this discernment then leads to dreaming. And reflecting on these questions that we just went through, strengths, growing edges, hopes, allows space for us to imagine and to experiment. And the beauty of a transition arrives most often during the dreaming stage. It arrives at this point during the dreaming stage because it's a time of experimentation. And it helps kind of, like I said before, moving into these what if questions. What if we did this? What if we did that? And as I said, these what if questions will help you discover what kind of gifts and skills to look for in your next pastor. And like I said, it'll take some time to do this discernment and to this dreaming point, and that's okay. These conversations too that you're having, you could always bring in your conference minister too to help you discern these questions. And as I was saying before, that after you go through this discerning stage and dreaming stage, if you've come up with some concrete ideas, then write those down. Have your leadership group or some group make a list and post it somewhere for all the congregation to see, to remind everyone of the discussions that have been leading up to searching for your pastor. I also think that these questions that I offered and then kind of the conversation that you all have as a congregation next, that they can also help you complete the Congregational Information Form or the CIF. It's this form that you use to kind of help discern what kind of pastor you need at this point, what kind of gifts and skills would benefit you, where you feel in terms of where you feel like God is calling you. And so with mentioning the CIF, we're going to move into the practical steps. But before I do that, I want to say one more thing because it came up a lot in some of the questions you all asked. And this is what I'll say to you, is that I know for certain that you most definitely will find a pastor. It will take time to find the right fit, but I encourage you not to rush the process. I encourage you not to compare yourself to other congregations. Every congregation is different. I know that for myself, when I was in the search process as a pastor, there was this time when no one was calling me, right? I had no offers. And then a church reached out to me and I considered that congregation. I interviewed with them. But it just didn't feel right. And even though it was so hard to say no to this search committee when I had no other options, like there was nothing else coming down the line, I knew that that's not where God was calling me. And so I said no. And then eventually, a congregation did come forth, and it was a great fit for me. And I thank them. And likewise I say this to you as a congregation. You may have candidates you might have candidates trickle in one at a time. And they may not be a good fit. And it may be really hard to say no because you really are looking for a pastor. But I encourage you in those moments to tend to the Holy Spirit, to spend time in prayer and in conversation to really discern whether or not this pastor is the fit for your congregation. Because fit is everything. I also want to add here that pastoral candidates need clarity, and so does the congregation. And so when I say clarity, I'm mostly referring to before you form the search committee, that you have a job description ready to go. That you have paid attention to who your congregation is. So if you do not have a job description and you're on this call, probably your number one thing to do after this call is to write your job description. You also need to consider your congregation and ask yourselves and be honest about the following questions. Is your congregation ready for a female pastor? What is the status of inclusion for the queer community? Be crystal clear about these things. It is very, very important for you as a congregation and for any candidate that might come your way. So let me say this again. Your congregation will find a pastor. No matter where you're located, no matter your congregation's theological beliefs. And I know there's a lot of talk out there about are there enough pastors? That was another question that was in the chat. And I can say, because I talk to every person who is interested in ministry and therefore completes an MLI, which I'll talk about in a minute, that there are people looking to minister within Mennonite Church USA. Before this webinar, I did a quick count. It was very, very quick, not scientific, but a quick count. And we have about the same number of candidates as there are openings. Now, of course, not every candidate is interested in going to all the places. People can be very particular on where they wish to go as a pastor. So while there is about the same number, that does not mean we have that same number on our national registry. The national registry is a list of people interested in ministry positions who are willing to have any of the 14 conferences contact them, and therefore they're interested in going to any of the 14 conferences of Mennonite Church USA. Generally, candidates label themselves limited, meaning that I only send their MLI to the conference of which they have interest, which is usually like 1 or 2 conferences. So while there is about the same number, which was I think around 30, I do know that not everybody is interested in going to all the places. And while I really encourage pastors to consider putting themselves on the national registry, I respect their choices when they say, no, I'm only interested in these 1 or 2 conferences. And sometimes some conferences are a better fit than others for folks. So I do my part, but I respect their choices. Lastly, I want to say that building and the shaping of pastors begins at home. And so I also want you to consider as a congregation, does the congregation or has your congregation shoulder tapped anyone to consider ministry? Does your congregation offer financial support to seminarians? I encourage you to reflect on what your congregation is doing themselves to call and support MCUSA pastors. So those are the things to consider when thinking about, will you find a pastor? Yes, you will. One former conference minister said to me that she would always say to those churches she was working with, trust the process. The Holy Spirit is working. And I've kind of taken her words as my own in this role to say, trust the Holy Spirit. The process will work for you. All right, let's get into the practical steps. And here we are. There are 7 of them. The first is saying goodbye to your pastor, which we already talked about. Second stage is this discerning and dreaming. The third, which I'll get into these next steps here in a minute. The third is determining whether you need an interim or a transitional pastor. Then forming the search committee. Then the search committee doing their work with the support of the area conference, calling the candidate of choice, and then everybody's favorite, welcoming your new pastor. So what I'm curious about now is where people are in these practical steps. And I think if Cami has the survey ready, here we go. We have a poll. It's in the chat. If you would click on that and then choose where you are on these 4 or in these 7 steps, then we'll kind of get a sense of where the group is as a whole. So go ahead and click on that. And then Cami, you can let me know, or you can put in the chat what the results are. So go ahead and click on that link. Give you a moment to do that. All right. As Cami is putting together the results, I'll start working through these steps with us. So, like I said, we've already talked about saying goodbye to your pastor. That's always step number 1, saying goodbye. And then there's that discerning and dreaming section, which often the outcome of that is your congregational information form and the job description for your pastor. And just a little side note, the job description should be ideally formed with input from the congregation, but formed by the leadership of the congregation, whatever that is for you, not necessarily the search committee. The search committee has a big enough job as it is. So the congregational information form and the job description and some other forms should be documents that the search committee gathers versus creates. But let's talk about determining if you need an interim pastor or a transitional pastor. First, let's start with some definitions. Transitional pastors are specialists who provide leadership that enables a congregation to work at a focused agenda, which results in whatever the congregation needs. So that could be healing, clarifying identity, discerning a new vision, setting a fresh tone for the next pastor, that kind of thing. Transitional pastors, they take care of the usual pastoral ministries on their own, but also through empowering others to assist in the ministry of the church. Transitional pastors most often tend to be used when there has been some kind of conflict in a congregation or following a long-term pastor. That's generally how we used to talk about it, but more often than not, pastors or congregations are choosing transitional pastors because it does allow a transitional pastor can support this discerning and dreaming process. Cami has put the results in, and it looks like most everyone, if you click on it, you'll see It looks like most everyone, majority are in the search committee phase. Second, maybe discerning. So, okay. So it's also helpful to see where people kind of find themselves in this. Thank you for taking the time to do that. There's a question in the chat about how do you determine long-term pastor? It is kind of a relative term, but I would say anywhere between 10, 13, 20 years, I'm going to arbitrarily say is long-term pastor. I've been noticing that pastors tend to stay in their positions at their churches longer than when I started, like almost 20 years ago. So sometimes that sweet spot is around 13 to 15 years. So good question about long-term pastor. Let's move to interim pastor. Interim pastors provide maintenance in a congregation, basically doing the usual things that a pastor does. Not necessarily doing that dreaming and visioning point, just making sure that worship continues to happen, that pastoral care continues to happen with, of course, the support of the congregation. Now, your conference minister can help you determine which is the best for you and your congregation. And speaking of conference ministers, they are an important piece of the transition process. Typically, when a pastor announces that they're leaving, one of the first steps of the leadership board for your congregation, again, elders, church council, whatever you call the shepherds, whatever you call that group, usually one of the first steps is to be in touch with their conference minister. I guess here too is where I'll say each conference is different in terms of, is it a conference minister who does this job, the regional pastor, the district pastor, search guides. Essentially, it's a conference leader is there to support you in this process. And it's this conference leader who will lay out the steps and describe the process and provide support along the way. For example, the conference minister will attend the first meeting of the search committee to provide an orientation to the search process. From there, the conference minister or whomever your conference contact is will be in touch with the search committee chair and others as needed. The conference minister is also the one who provides the MLIs, which is essentially the resume for pastors, to the search committee. So you determine what you need, you form your search committee. Generally, it's a microcosm of your congregation. Maybe it's people who you know will work closely with the pastor. Maybe you want to make sure you have ages, various ages that represent the congregation, the education, theological understanding, that kind of stuff. So the search committee is to represent the congregation. And then the biggest step, the step where looks like most of us are in, is the search committee does their work. And then after they do their work, they will call a candidate of choice, which has several steps to it, which we'll go through here in a minute. And then, of course, the welcoming of the new pastor. Now, before we get into some of these other steps, I know that I've mentioned several documents, and I want to kind of go through 3 important documents. The first one is the Congregational Information Form, or the CIF. This form is to assist the congregation in presenting information concerning who they are as a congregation to prospective candidates for this ministry, for this pastoral position. Completing the form will also assist the pastoral search committee in understanding, who the congregation is as they assess the strengths and weaknesses of each candidate that comes their way. There's one question that I get the most often from conference ministers and pastors and search committee members, and that is the pastoral priority section of the MLI, which stands for, by the way, Ministerial Leadership Information Form. So let me just talk about this priority list. It is a list of 24 things a pastor might find themselves doing at any given time. It is clearly not an exhaustive list, but is a list to get started. And this worksheet is filled out by both pastors and congregations. The pastor fills it out on their MLI, and the congregation fills it out in their Congregational Information Form. And it's designed to identify the perceived needs and priorities of the congregation and the priorities and vision of the candidate. It's intended to kind of give a sense of, again, who the congregation is and what sort of pastoral guidance do they need now. Often what I hear the most is, well, everything's a priority. Well, sure. But no one person can do all the things. So it's important to say, given who we are as a congregation, these are the 6 areas that we could benefit our pastor giving leadership. And then you have 6 low items that you say, these areas, while important, we don't feel like the pastor needs to focus all of their time with these. Maybe this is the work of the congregation to do. And then in the middle, you have 12, which are kind of like, yes, these are important. We'll do this work together. Things ebb and flow. And so the priorities are not saying these 6 trump everything else. It's more like, given who we are, these are the 6 priorities that we could use pastoral support guidance in. So keep that in mind when you fill out that form or when you're reading the pastor's form. And I also tell folks that it's really a point of conversation to ask, why this one? Why not that one? Where are we different? Where are we the same? You're not looking for a perfect match when it comes to pastoral priorities. I mean, I suppose it could happen, but generally speaking, it's just a way to say, okay, given who we are, this is the sort of pastoral person, qualities, characteristics that we feel as a congregation we are looking for. So there are other things on the CIF, but I just wanted to mention that because I know I get a lot of questions about these. The pastoral priorities can be done in various ways. Congregations all do them differently. Sometimes the leadership group that fills out the CIF will fill out the pastoral priorities. Other times, depending on the size of the congregation, maybe everybody gives their 2 cents on what the priorities are, and then a smaller group, then kind of given the feedback, will adjust accordingly. So that is one way to work it out. It depends on the culture of your congregation and how you typically make decisions together. So can't give you do it this way. It's really based upon the congregation. Again, your conference minister can provide support too on best practices and what they've seen as most helpful. Someone in the chat said they used a Google survey. So yeah, you can do that too. Your CIF can be made available to, or should be made available to candidates. You can post it on your website. You can email it. If you're having an interview, you can email that to your conference minister to share with candidates. It's not meant to be a document that's held back till the very last minute. Similar to the MLI, it is something for the candidate to read and view so they have an understanding of who you are and come into an interview prepared to have a discussion. So now let's move to the job description. This is generally created by the leadership board and affirmed by the congregation, or again, whatever your standard practice is as a congregation. If everyone gives feedback into it and that works for you, great. If it's more helpful for a group of elders, council to put it together and share it with the congregation for feedback, that's great too. Personally, it's better if folks can, if there's a select group of people who are working on it and then they can get feedback from the congregation. I find people do better when they have something to react to versus an empty slate. So that should be done right away. And basically, a job description includes the FTE, major responsibilities, education, other characteristics and qualities, experience or educational requirements, those sorts of things. Lastly, here of our documents, let's move to the Ministerial Leadership Information Form, or the MLI. All people interested in applying for ministry positions in Mennonite Church USA are required to fill out an MLI. I would say even if they're members of your congregation and you know them, and I'm sure you do, but an MLI is still very beneficial and deeply recommended. And that's because an MLI provides an equal and consistent starting point for the search committee, for the congregation, and for the candidates. It's helpful to have this document because it provides transparency, clarity, and consistency for all of Mennonite Church USA pastors and congregations. Your conference minister will act as the go-between for the search committee and potential candidates. So it's okay to shoulder tap to encourage someone to apply, but once the MLI starts, conference minister is best practice. The MLI provides a variety of information. It provides information on the candidate's background, their education, their employment, their ministry history. Again, they rate themselves in the pastoral, or they do the pastoral priorities, and they do the 34 skills and gifts. Probably the most important part is that you get a brief introduction to their theology, their spiritual life, and their understanding of ministry. The committee will also receive a summary of their 4 references. And the references include, at this point, 3 folks of their choice and a conference minister. We also, with the MLI, there are the results of a background check, which check on criminal history and sex offender history. So all of our pastors are background checked through the MLI process. So the MLI, including all of their essays, the surveys they filled out, along with the references, are a conversation starter for the search committee and the candidate. The MLI will not tell you everything you need to know. It's just a way to start the conversation. I also encourage you to pay attention to the reference summary, which is a summary of their references, to pay attention to how each reference recommends the candidate. There are multiple recommendations. There is recommend without reservations, recommend, recommend with reservations, and do not recommend. So I encourage you to pay attention to those recommendations. If they're all the same, that's interesting. That's a question to ask references on their recommendation. If they're all different, that's something to consider as well. I will note that at the bottom of the reference summary is another mini reference summary that currently comes from me as the denominational minister of ministerial leadership. I read every MLI and every reference summary. And after reading all of that and all that information, and of course, I've had a conversation with the candidate, then I will put together a summary based upon what the references have said, and then also give a recommendation given everything that has been compiled. So that's something to pay attention to as well. Let's move into the the candidating weekend, let's move into the interviewing section of the process. So there's a couple, I'd say 3 stages of interviewing. The first stage is just the initial stage. It is reading through the MLI, it's scheduling an interview. The purpose is just to begin to get a sense of who this person is and if they're a fit for the congregation. Because as I said before, the fit between your congregation and the candidate is so very important. And so this process takes time, and it requires some mutuality between the search committee and the candidate. During this interviewing stage, I encourage the search committee to stay in touch with your area conference minister as you proceed, requesting help and counsel and suggestions. They are there to help. It's like literally a part of their job description to support you in this search. So don't hesitate to reach out to your conference minister or whatever conference leader title of person who is supporting you through your journey. It's important to keep the congregation informed of the process, but you also need to remember that much of the process is intended to be confidential. The names of candidates are not to be shared. In these first 2 stages in particular, this is a confidential time. I know people are curious. I know the Mennonite world is very small, but we need to do our best to keep this part of the process confidential. So the first stage, the first interview, the stage is confidential, and the purpose of the first interview is to discuss the job expectations and to assess the qualities of the candidate and what they would bring to the role of pastor. So this is like get to know you. And at this stage, you can interview as many people as you wish to, as many people are available to you. So it's everyone. After you do the initial interview, the search committee will prayerfully discern which candidates the search committee would like to invite for a second interview. Generally, you limit the second interview to 1 to 2 candidates. And of course, for those to whom you're not following up with or not extending a second interview, please be in contact with them right away. Via phone call, via email, just let them know where the process is. For this first interview, usually because of the nature where we are, if it's a Zoom interview, that's fine. If it can be in person, that's okay too. But keep that in mind when you're having conversations with folks. The second stage is still confidential, and ideally it's in person. If that person is able to meet with the search committee in person, that is the ideal. And like I said, the second interview is reserved for 1 to 2 candidates. In this interview, I suggest that you ask questions that are specific to your congregation and your context. Be honest about your hopes and dreams for the congregation, going back to that discerning and dreaming part that you did previously, kind of pull that in now into the conversation and get a sense of if this congregation or if this pastor would be a good fit for how you're thinking or imagining how God is calling you at this stage. After you do these interviews, again, spend time in prayer, in discernment, allowing the Holy Spirit to move to determine which candidate is then going to be recommended as the candidate of choice. So you inform the candidate who is the candidate of choice, and you also let the other folks that you've interviewed know where they are in the process, that you've chosen a candidate of choice. So this next step is kind of a two-parter. It's the third stage of interview, and it's calling the candidate of choice. So part one involves the search committee and the congregational leadership. So once there is a candidate of choice, the search committee meets with the leadership board and offers their recommendation on who the candidate of choice should be. The search committee provides written documentation to the leadership board as to why they're recommending this particular candidate. The leadership board then accepts or rejects the search committee's candidate of choice. Best practice here is to take some kind of vote or do consensus, like whatever decision making you normally do as a leadership board, do that. So if it's voting, do that. If it's consensus, do that. So you want to stay true to who you are and how you make decisions in this stage. But the point is that you either accept or reject the search committee's process, and you record the minutes and the outcome of the decision. Once the candidate of choice is recommended and has been accepted by the leadership team, then you inform your conference minister that you've settled on a candidate of choice. Then the search committee and the leadership board then publicly announce the name of the candidate of choice to the congregation. I suggest that this is both by letter, which can be a physical letter in mailboxes if you still have those, or via email, but also as a public, like verbal announcement. Do it multiple ways. And when you make this announcement of your candidate of choice, it should also include the dates that the candidate will visit, the schedule of events, and the time and date of the congregational meeting in which the congregation will discern whether or not to call this candidate as their pastor. So there's some work, some administrative work that needs to happen together with the search committee and the leadership board. And I see a question into the chat, and I'm right there. I'm going to be there in a second about the benefits package here. So then we get to the second part, which is the candidating weekend. And so this is that weekend that the search committee and the church leadership will jointly arrange for the candidate, and if they have a family, their family as well, to meet and visit the congregation. Here's where I want to say that to remember that you're calling the candidate of choice. You're not calling the family. It is not recommended that you ask the spouse questions. It's definitely not recommended that you ask the children questions. You are not calling them. You are not hiring them. They are not working for the church. I just want to be very clear on that. So, keep that in mind when if the family is there. that of course, be nice to the spouse and the children, but they should not be called to account in a public setting. Now that happens. My spouse has both times. He's responded. It's not been thrilled, but he's responded. So, but it's not a comfortable space in that setting. So just remember that. Um, as you're planning this committee or this candidate meeting, continue to keep your area conference minister informed of your progress and of your anticipated action, like when is this happening? They are invited into that candidating weekend as well. So during this stage, this is when the negotiation begins with the pastor salary guidelines, which includes things like benefits, housing, sabbatical policy, beginning date, length of service. And it might be helpful too at that time to have, or it would be helpful at that time of the candidating weekend of having the covenant of understanding or memo of understanding outlined and ready to go for the for the candidate. And generally, it's someone from the leadership team to go over together. It may be helpful when you're negotiating the salary or the covenant of understanding to have the area conference minister there as well. They can provide some context, some guidance, especially if the pastor is new. They may want, if this is their first ministry assignment, they may want the conference minister there just to kind of help them understand like what's normal. A congregation, you all don't do this very often. So again, having the conference minister there can be helpful in terms of like, all right, how does this go? Where are the forms? How do we do this? So, but it's during this initial candidating weekend that you go through these expectations. So that is definitely appropriate to go over. Also, during this final stage, with the candidate, during the candidating weekend, generally these things happen. The candidate meets with the leadership board and other key groups in the congregation. This kind of goes back again to the pastoral priorities. If there's particular areas that your pastor is working in or you'd like this candidate to work in, and there are maybe some committees formed, it may be helpful for them to meet with those committees, for example. The candidate is given an opportunity to usually give a sermon or some sort of public presentation. There is an open invitation for the congregation to meet the candidate. So there is this congregational-wide meeting. I will say, just like a pro tip that I've personally found helpful as a candidate myself, was when it was a meeting of all the congregation, and it was like we're having an ice cream social, essentially. The tables were full, and I was a bit overwhelmed about how to talk with everyone. And a member of the search committee came up next to me, and he took me to each table. And when it was time to leave, he was like, "Oh, Rachel, okay, we're going to the next table. We're going to the next table." So I was able to talk to every table with the support of a search committee member. So just throw that out there. People can get caught in conversation quite easily, and you want an opportunity for the candidate to meet as many people as possible. The congregation has an opportunity to ask questions. The candidate has an opportunity to ask questions. And often the candidate is also has time to visit the community, maybe look for housing if that's needed, or maybe get an understanding of where the schools are if they have children who are in that age range. If their spouse is looking for employment, allowing space for that too, discerning what may they do if they're moving from one geographical location to another. So not only is it the church community, but it's also giving space for the candidate to view the community at large. The process concludes with a congregational vote, or again, however your congregation makes decisions. If you have things written down in your bylaws, follow those. Again, pay attention to how you make decisions as a congregation and follow those ways of doing. This is not the time to make something up or do something new, right? Keep to what you normally do. So once the congregation makes a decision, and typically the candidate is not present for that, you want to have space for everyone to be able to talk about their experience of the candidate without the candidate present. Sometimes the decision the congregation makes happens that Sunday. Sometimes it happens the next week. Sometimes it happens several days later. Again, that is for you as a congregation to discern best ways of doing on what has worked best for you. And again, conference minister kind of help discern that along with you on what's best. So once there is an outcome, the candidate will receive ideally in an email, followed up by a phone call, getting the results of the vote or consensus decision. If the candidate decides for whatever reason that the outcome of the decision, they don't feel comfortable with that, they can always pull their name out. I always talk about this being a mutual decision. Both parties get to decide. Just because the congregation says yes doesn't mean the candidate will say yes. So keep that in mind. So the congregation or the candidate will then respond, whether that's through an email, a phone call, etc. As soon as that response is had, then that is shared with the congregation in multiple ways, as well as with the conference minister. And of course, if your candidate responds, if it's an affirmative for both parties, then you get the fantastic job of welcoming your new pastor. I see that there are some questions in the chat, so I'm going to take a minute to look at those. So we have a question here about the early stages in the process. What if one or two candidates who might be okay, but not excitingly a great fit? Is it appropriate to wait, or should we settle for the best available option? I'm a firm believer that in this very hypothetical situation, I would wait. I think you need to make sure it is an exceedingly great fit. Maybe I'm being idealistic, and you can say that if you want. But I do think it's important to not settle for okay, for mid, for meh, but for someone who you're excited about. That will bode well for the tenure of that pastor and also for the vibrancy of your congregation. So I would suggest wait, but you need to do what's best for your congregation. Another question, you outlined your first and second interview assumes there's more than one candidate. If we only have one candidate 3 months at a time, is it appropriate to move with the second interview for fit? I think so. In that case, if you want to know more about the candidate and you're kind of having kind of more like drops of candidates versus, a big flow, then yeah, that's definitely appropriate to move forward with a second interview with them. Some other questions here. Oh, there was a second part to David's question. What if we have doubts about about that there might be a better fit after the second view, but they are good, not great. Again, that's a discernment for you all to discern. I do believe that there are fantastic pastors out there. Um, I get to talk to so many pastors, and we have so many great candidates out there. And so I would I would consider discerning on the great, but again, you'll need to decide what's best for your congregation, and maybe um, yeah, the second interview could be very helpful, and you might just need to have some real talk with the congregation. Um, Another question, I would be interested to hear where the arrival of the interim and transitioner typically falls. Um, so that typically happens towards the beginning. The transitional and or interim pastor is generally decided by the leadership team, not the search committee. And so as you're saying goodbye to the pastor, it would be normal to be letting your conference minister know that you're interested in either one or the other. And typically they're able to offer some ideas of folks that they can then offer to the leadership team. So you don't want that person called or hired before the pastor leaves, but you can be initiating that process um, as you're planning the goodbye, because that's not a congregational thing. That is a leadership thing. Um, we may close as a church in 5 years. Can some candidates handle this? There are some candidates who can handle this. Some an example came to mind, but it's kind of vague at the moment. They did not know that they were going to be stepping into this, but it turned out to be a very holy moment for this pastor and this congregation. So this is where you need to be having frank conversations with the candidate, with your conference minister, and as a congregation as a whole. If this is you, if you might close in 5 years, I hope these conversations are happening at a wide congregational level and with the support of your conference minister. Um, let's see. Is there a separate list for transitional specialists? Yes. So we do have a list. MCUSA, we do have a list of transitional pastors and interim pastors. Um, We also have a few transitional pastors who are on the national registry, meaning that they're willing to go to any of the MCUSA conferences. I think there's just two of them, but they are amazing transitional pastors, and your conference minister would have access to the national registry where those folks are listed. And in communication with me, I can share names of transitional and interim pastors with your conference minister. Um, the list that we have is sometimes a little wonky because sometimes people do this for a while and then I think they're still doing it, and then conference minister reaches out and tells me, oh, they've decided to do something else now. So, a little give and take on that list, but we do have one. Um, let's see. Where is it best for the interim and transitional to be when stage 3 happens? Um, so so stage 3 is determining if you need an interim or transitional pastor. Um, this can happen during that discerning and dreaming if you want support in that area. For a transitional pastor, that is their jam. Um, if you're wanting an interim pastor, then you can wait for that or start that person off right away before the dreaming and discerning section. Um, are there appropriate ways to be networking with pastors, or how do we seek to share their opportunity of candidates outside of what happens through the work of your conference minister? Um, yeah, so there are a variety of ways to share your opening. Oh, wait. Oh, sorry. I guess I'm okay. So there are various ways to share. I will tell you one story that I did not believe that this would happen, but then it did. So people are asking whether or not they should, or let me put it this way. I recommend putting your pastoral opening in Anabaptist World. Um, Pastors read that. I at first wasn't sure if that was an effective way. But then I learned that just through my conversations with pastors that they are checking that. And so that is one way to do it. We also have the Pastoral Mennonite Church USA Pastoral Openings webpage, which lists all the conferences and their openings. Pastors do check that, especially if they've been in the MCUSA world for any amount of time. They know it exists and they will check that out. So that is another way to have your information out there. So, and then of course, there's putting it on your website. There's talking with your conference minister or with other conference ministers that you know. Shoulder tapping is always good. Let's see here. Okay. Do search committees have access to the National Registry? No, they don't. Only conference ministers have access to that, and that is the way, and that's due to how our process is, where the conference minister is guiding the process, going through reading through MLIs and then sharing them with conferences. I will say conference ministers handle MLIs in different ways. Some conference ministers will read through the MLIs that are available, and if they feel like the candidate is a good fit for them, then they will send off that MLI. If they feel like it will not be a good fit for that congregation, they may not. Some conference ministers will send every MLI that's available. There are different philosophies for why one might do one or the other. So I would talk with their conference minister on their philosophy on sharing the names of candidates and sharing MLIs. Okay. If you have an interim, where is the person to be when you have a candidate? Are they informed with the congregation or before? So the interim or transitional pastor is not a part of the search process. Of course, they'll know that interviews are coming, but they aren't necessarily given that name ahead of time. They'll find out when the congregation finds out, because that's not a part of what their role or what they're doing. So they wouldn't be in that process. They would be informed as soon as the congregation is informed. Cami has put in the MCUSA pastoral openings page. I think that's what that one is. So welcome to click on that to see the openings. Your conference minister is the one who lets us know when that needs to be updated or changed. So if you see things there that you're like, wait, we already have a pastor, that's good to know, and will let us know about that information. Did I get to everyone's question? If not, raise your hand or restate your question in the chat. I think I got through them. Okay. Well, as we conclude here, I want to just thank you for taking the time to join this webinar. As you're in this process, don't hesitate to reach out to your conference minister. You're also welcome to reach out to me, but I might say that's that's a question for your conference minister. I don't typically get involved in the nitty-gritty of pastoral searches unless there is a transition in the conference minister position, and then I sometimes am involved in the process. But typically, your conference minister is your person. But if there are like some technical questions that you have, let me know. In the chat earlier, Cami dropped the web page with the pastoral transition for congregations that lists out much of the information that I talked about. I also wrote a blog a while back on transitions, and I get more into the discernment and dreaming section. So if you're wanting to know more, the blog, there we go, is the beauty of a pastoral transition, and that's also in the chat. So I want to say thank you very much once again. And for the latest Mennonite Church USA events, subscribe to Piecemeal, our biweekly email newsletter, and Cami put that in the chat. And I'll also just add that if you found this webinar to be helpful, please prayerfully consider supporting the ongoing work of Mennonite Church USA by a donation to our annual fund. And Cami will put that link in our chat. We would not have these resources without you. I'm always amazed of how churches, we support one another financially with our time, with our resources. And I'm just grateful for all of you and for the support you have for your congregations, for your conference, and Mennonite Church USA. We would not be Mennonite Church USA without all of you. So thank you very much. And prayers of blessing and peace as you go about this process. Thank you all.